On the dawn of October 27th, 1942, 420 miles northeast of Guadalcanal, Commander Edward P. Parker clutched the railing of the USS Northampton. He watched in silence as the burning wreckage of the USS Hornet slipped beneath the waves of the South Pacific, claiming 140 American lives and marking the loss of the last operational fleet carrier in the region. The blaze from her ruptured fuel tanks illuminated the water for miles, transforming the ocean into a mirror of flame that reflected the absolute catastrophe befalling American naval power. Parker confided to his personal log that losing 4 carriers in 10 months meant they would have nothing left by Christmas, a sentiment so defeatist it could have warranted a court-martial had his superiors discovered it. Through the smoke and darkness, he had just witnessed the destruction of the 4th American fleet carrier of 1942, following the Lexington at the Coral Sea on May 8th, the Yorktown at Midway on June 7th, and the Wasp off Guadalcanal on September 15th. The Imperial Japanese Navy, a force American intelligence had dismissively labeled as inferior copyists incapable of innovation, had systematically annihilated over half of America's Pacific carrier strength. While Japanese workers in shipyards from Yokosuka to Kure were busy adding fresh vessels to their fleet, the United States was hemorrhaging ships at a rate that seemed impossible to sustain. 3,700 miles away, in Newport News, Virginia, a welder named Margaret Thompson was preparing for a night shift that would ultimately disprove Commander Parker's grim prediction. Neither the commander nor the welder realized that this moment of profound despair signaled the start of the most remarkable production miracle in naval history. A systematic demonstration of American industrial capacity that would transform not just the Pacific War, but the very nature of naval power itself. The equation for victory was about to be rewritten, not through superior seamanship or battlefield tactics, but by the sparks of welding torches, the rhythm of assembly lines, and the sheer, awakened, productive fury of a democracy at war. The collapse of American carrier power in 1942 would ignite a response so overwhelming that Japanese naval officers would later liken it to fighting the stars themselves. No matter how many vessels the enemy destroyed, more appeared to take their place. Within just 3 years, American shipyards would launch 14 Essex-class fleet carriers that saw combat, a number exceeding Japan's total production for the entire war. This shift from disaster to dominance would not be born of tactical brilliance or technological breakthroughs, but from something far more fundamental. It was the complete mobilization of American industrial democracy, turning housewives into welders and farm boys into shipfitters, that converted the entire nation into what Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had feared most, an arsenal of unlimited productive capacity. The sequence of disasters had begun on May 8, 1942, in the Coral Sea, with the loss of the USS Lexington. One of America's 2 giant pre-war carriers, converted from battlecruiser hulls, the Lexington absorbed 2 torpedo hits and 3 bomb strikes from Japanese aircraft. Despite heroic damage control efforts that initially saved the ship, gasoline vapors from ruptured aviation fuel tanks triggered massive secondary explosions, sending Lady Lex to the bottom, along with 216 of her crew, as the war's first fleet carrier loss. Captain Frederick Sherman, the Lexington's commanding officer, would later testify before Congress that the United States entered the conflict with 7 fleet carriers in the Pacific against Japan's 10. Every admiral understood the grim arithmetic. The Navy could not afford to trade ships evenly, let alone lose them faster than the enemy. Yet the second blow fell just a month later. On June 7, 1942, the USS Yorktown, miraculously repaired in just 48 hours at Pearl Harbor after sustaining damage in the Coral Sea, succumbed to torpedoes from the Japanese submarine 168. Although her participation was crucial to the strategic triumph at Midway, where 4 Japanese carriers were sunk, America had lost another of her precious few fleet carriers. September 15th brought the third catastrophe, when the USS Wasp, operating off Guadalcanal, was struck by 3 torpedoes from the Japanese submarine 19. The carrier burned for hours before being scuttled by the American destroyer Lansdowne, meaning that of the 7 fleet carriers available in the Pacific at the start of the war, America had now lost 3. The knockout blow arrived during the Battle of Santa Cruz on October 26th and 27th, 1942, when the USS Hornet, a veteran of the Doolittle Raid and Midway, fell victim to coordinated attacks by Japanese dive bombers and torpedo planes. Despite desperate efforts to save her, including an attempt to tow the burning vessel, advancing enemy surface forces compelled her abandonment. The Japanese destroyers Makigumo and Akigumo delivered the final blow in the early hours of October 27th, finishing what their aircraft had started. In Washington, Admiral Ernest King, the Chief of Naval Operations, presented Congress with a bleak reality, stating that only the Enterprise remained as an operational fleet carrier in the Pacific, against 10 Japanese counterparts. Simple mathematics suggests we have already lost the war, King concluded. Yet he was unaware of Margaret Thompson and the 1.7 million workers who were preparing to flood American shipyards by 1944. He did not foresee Henry Kaiser, who was on the verge of slashing the construction time for Liberty ships from 230 days to a mere 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. Nor did he know that American shipyards, which had launched exactly 1 fleet carrier in 1941, were poised to achieve the impossible. This transformation began not in military planning rooms, but in the accounting offices of Newport News Shipbuilding, where Yard Supervisor Clay Bedford called an emergency meeting on December 8, 1941, 1 day after Pearl Harbor. "Forget everything you know about shipbuilding," he announced to his foremen, declaring their intention to build carriers with the same mass production methods Ford used for cars. The revolution commenced with a straightforward observation from Helen Matthews, a former seamstress who had just been recruited as part of the emergency expansion. It began with a simple observation of skilled laborers painstakingly driving rivets into hull plates, prompting a question that would fundamentally alter naval production. Why not join the metal like fabric, using a single continuous seam rather than thousands of individual points? While the supervisor initially scoffed at the idea, the logic was undeniable. Replacing riveting with welding promised to slash assembly time by 75%. Moreover, this shift traded the years of training required for a master riveter for a simpler skill set that could be taught to a novice in mere days, unlocking a massive, untapped labor pool. By the summer of 1943, this industrial pivot sparked a production explosion that defied all expectations, with Essex-class carriers leaving the slipways at an incomprehensible rate. The lead ship, USS Essex herself, had gone from her keel laying on April 28, 1941, to being fully commissioned on December 31, 1942. A transformation from raw steel to combat readiness achieved in just 20 months. Yet, this remarkable feat was merely the opening move in a much larger industrial strategy. At the Brooklyn Navy Yard, shipfitter First Class Giuseppe Diageo, a cousin of the famous baseball player, spearheaded a crew that revolutionized the installation of aircraft elevators. Rather than constructing them piece by piece inside the hull, they pre-assembled the massive platforms entirely on shore before hoisting them into place with heavy cranes. This single adjustment in methodology shaved a full 6 weeks off the construction time for every carrier involved. The techniques pioneered by Henry Kaiser at Richmond soon permeated the entire industry, particularly the concept of prefabrication, which allowed deckhouses and fixtures to be assembled in dedicated production zones. By building these structures on their sides or upside down, welders could work with gravity rather than against it, creating stronger bonds with far less effort. The efficiency gains were staggering. Tasks that once consumed the labor of 1,000 workers for a month were now being completed by just 200 people in a single week. The results of these innovations began to accumulate with terrifying velocity as the gap between construction and commissioning collapsed. USS Yorktown, laid down in December 1941, was commissioned by April 1943, followed closely by USS Intrepid in August. USS Hornet, laid down in August 1942, joined the fleet in November 1943, while USS Franklin took barely a year from her December 1942 start to her January 1944 commissioning. As each launch occurred in quicker succession, Philip Kellogg, a welder at Bethlehem Steel's Fall River shipyard, chronicled this acceleration in his personal diary. He noted that by January 1943, they were launching a carrier every 60 days, a rate that tightened to 45 days by June, and finally, to a ship every 30 days by December. As Kellogg astutely observed, the Japanese forces must have believed the Americans were employing some form of industrial magic. The true source of this magic, however, was a human wave of unparalleled dedication. By April 1943, women comprised 40% of the workforce in Kaiser's facilities. At the Norfolk Naval Shipyard, Emma Rodriguez, a Mexican-American mother of 3 who had previously handled nothing heavier than a sewing needle, evolved into the yard's most efficient riveter. She could drive 30 perfect rivets in a single minute, putting seasoned professionals to shame. Following Executive Order 8802, which prohibited discrimination in defense industries, African American workers flooded into skilled positions previously denied to them. James Washington, formerly a sharecropper from Alabama, rose to become a master pipe fitter at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, personally installing fuel lines on 5 successive carriers, finishing each one faster than the last. These workers understood they were not merely building ships, they were racing against death itself. The urgency was palpable, for every day lost in production translated to more American sailors and Marines perishing on distant Pacific islands. To keep this reality front and center, photographs from the fleet were plastered on every shipyard wall, carrying stark messages. The USS Enterprise was fighting alone and desperately needed her sisters, driving the workforce to build them now. Speed was driven not only by grit, but by a technological revolution, most notably the modular construction techniques developed by engineers at the New York Naval Yard. Abandoning the traditional method of building a hull piece by piece from the keel up, they instead fabricated entire sections, complete with internal wiring, plumbing, and ventilation. These massive, pre-outfitted components were then brought together and assembled like gigantic building blocks. This process was further streamlined by the use of highly standardized components, allowing the fastest builds to be completed in as little as 14 months. Every carrier utilized identical pumps, electrical panels, and fittings, ensuring that parts manufactured in Detroit could be seamlessly installed in hulls under construction in Newport News, Brooklyn, or Philadelphia without a single modification. The resulting Essex-class became the most significant line of warships in American history, emerging not just as replacements, but as superior vessels, displacing 27,100 tons, capable of carrying up to 100 aircraft and steaming at 33 knots. They outran most destroyers, a fact immediately noted by the enemy. Commander Masatake Okumiya of the Japanese Combined Fleet lamented in his diary that the Americans were building carriers faster than Japan could train pilots, admitting they were no longer fighting the same navy they had attacked at Pearl Harbor. By March 1944, American shipyards had achieved the seemingly impossible, launching Essex-class carriers at a tempo that outstripped the combined carrier production of every other nation on Earth. While major naval yards focused on the fleet carriers, Henry Kaiser applied his revolutionary methods to the construction of escort carriers, the jeep carriers essential for hunting submarines and covering invasion fleets. Kaiser's Vancouver shipyard alone churned out 50 of these vessels. The lead ship, USS Casablanca, went from keel laying to commissioning in less than 8 months. This stood in stark contrast to the Japanese escort carrier Shinyo, which, despite being converted from an existing passenger liner, took a full 2 years to complete. Supporting this industrial frenzy was a supply chain that spanned the entire continent, acting as a synchronized symphony of logistics. Steel mills in Pittsburgh operated 24 hours a day to feed the shipyards, while Alcoa plants in Tennessee consumed the electricity of entire cities to provide the necessary aluminum. In Akron, Ohio, the Goodyear plant ramped up production of arresting gear cables, crucial for stopping 12,000-pound fighters, from 10 units a month to 200. Ensuring the fleet never lacked the muscle to catch its returning pilots. Producing warships is ultimately futile without trained personnel to operate them, a dilemma that Captain Daniel Gallery solved by proposing the Great Lakes as a massive naval aviation school. 2 paddle steamers, the USS Wolverine and USS Sable, were converted into training carriers and operated out of Chicago's Navy Pier to meet this desperate need. By 1944, this improvised training ground was qualifying 500 pilots every single month, creating a pipeline of aviators that the enemy could not hope to match. Meanwhile, in Tokyo, the Imperial Naval Staff watched these intelligence reports with mounting dread. Captain Toshikazu Omi, the operations officer for the combined fleet, later confessed that while they expected America to build ships to replace their losses, the reality was terrifying. They had estimated that the United States might manage to build 6 or 7 fleet carriers by 1945, but the actual production numbers were simply beyond their comprehension. When Admiral Jizaburo Ozawa led the Japanese carrier force at the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, the disparity in power was overwhelming. He faced a massive armada of 9 American fleet carriers and 8 light carriers, pitted against only 6 of his own vessels. As Ozawa himself later wrote, what ensued was not a battle in any traditional sense. It was essentially an execution. By January 1945, American shipyards had achieved an industrial rhythm that defied all logic and expectation. The Brooklyn Navy Yard was simultaneously working on 3 carriers, while Newport News had vessels in various stages of construction across 6 different slipways. The USS Lake Champlain established the ultimate record for wartime completion. Commissioned on June 3, 1945, she was finished in just 15 months, shattering all previous standards for capital ship construction. However, this incredible speed demanded a terrible human sacrifice, with shipyard accidents claiming over 3,000 lives during the war. Margaret O'Brien, who lost her husband when a crane cable snapped at the Fall River shipyard, returned to her welding station just a week later. She told her crew that every ship they failed to build would mean more gold stars in American windows, driving herself to take his place on the line. When the Japanese surrender delegation arrived aboard the USS Missouri on September 2, 1945, they sailed past a fleet that defied imagination. Tokyo Bay was filled with over 100 carriers of all types, a force larger than the total naval aviation history of all other nations combined. Commander Tamichihara, a decorated destroyer captain, noted grimly that while they had sunk 4 American carriers in 1942, the United States had replaced each loss 3 times over. The final accounting of the Essex-class carriers that saw combat reveals the sheer scale of this production effort. The USS Essex CV-9 led the way on December 31, 1942, followed in 1943 by the USS Yorktown on April 15th, USS Intrepid on August 16th, and USS Hornet on November 29th. That same year saw the arrival of the USS Lexington on February 17th, USS Bunker Hill on May 24th, and the USS Wasp on November 24th. The fleet expanded even further in 1944, with the USS Franklin commissioned on January 31st, followed by the USS Ticonderoga on May 8th and the USS Randolph on October 9th. The surge continued with the USS Hancock on April 15th, USS Bennington on August 6th, USS Bonhomme Richard on November 26th, and USS Shangri-La on September 15th. Several additional carriers were commissioned but did not see combat, including the USS Boxer on April 16, 1945, the record-breaking USS Lake Champlain on June 3rd, and the USS Antietam on January 28th. This count does not even include the 9 Independence-class light carriers built on cruiser hulls, or the more than 100 escort carriers produced during the same period. This revolution in shipbuilding permanently transformed American industry, as techniques developed for wartime production, such as modular construction and automated welding, became standard practice. The workforce itself changed forever. Women discovered they could master complex industrial tasks, and African Americans, previously restricted to menial labor, proved their capability for high-precision work, creating the backbone of the post-war economy. By 1945, American carrier production had reached levels that actually exceeded operational needs, with ships being completed faster than crews could be trained to man them. Admiral William Halsey testified to Congress in 1946 that the Navy had gone from a desperate shortage of carriers to having more than they could effectively use. No nation in the history of warfare has ever produced combat vessels at such an overwhelming rate. Decades later, during a 1985 reunion at Newport News Shipbuilding, over 5,000 former workers gathered to mark the 40th anniversary of VJ Day. Margaret Thompson, the welder mentioned earlier, stood before the crowd at 67 years old to correct the historical narrative. She declared that while they are now called the greatest generation, they were actually an angry generation. They built ships not for glory, but because every rivet drove home their retaliation for Pearl Harbor. Beyond military capability, the carrier building program fundamentally reshaped the American economy and society. Cities like Richmond, California, saw their populations explode from 23,000 to 130,000 in just 3 years. Over $3 billion in wages flowed through the hands of shipyard workers, helping to build the American middle class and breaking down social barriers that had existed for generations. By August 1945, the United States Navy operated a massive force, including 14 combat-tested Essex-class fleet carriers, 3 newly commissioned ones, 9 Independence-class light carriers, and 71 escort carriers. When compared to Japan's 6 operational carriers, most of which lacked trained pilots, and Britain's total of 19 carriers, The scale of American dominance was absolute. The ultimate testament to this achievement came in 1962, when Rear Admiral Hideo Yano of the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force visited the Norfolk Naval Shipyard. Standing on the very slipway where the USS Yorktown had been launched, Yano admitted through an interpreter that while they knew America was building ships, they had never imagined such an overwhelming scale of industrial power. How can one possibly contend with a nation capable of constructing more in a single shipyard than we could within our entire empire? We were not vanquished by your naval forces, but rather by your industrial plants, your labor force, and your resolve to manufacture far beyond any logical boundaries. This sentiment marked the ultimate realization of the conflict. Admiral Chester Nimitz provided the conclusive evaluation, asserting that the war's trajectory was determined in 1943, not through any specific combat engagement, but through the relentless deployment of fresh aircraft carriers. Once we reached a point where we could sustain the loss of a vessel and immediately have two successors sailing, whereas Japan was unable to replenish any of their deficits, the final result became a mathematical inevitability. Even today, the inheritance of that manufacturing marvel endures, as the methodologies developed between 1942 and 1945 continue to serve as the standard within the shipbuilding industry. However, the most significant inheritance may well be the proof of what a democratic society can accomplish when it is aligned in a singular objective. Within a span of 36 months, America transitioned from suffering the sinking of 4 carriers and staring down the barrel of potential ruin to commanding an overpowering naval dominance that rendered triumph unavoidable. The laborers responsible for this wonder demonstrated that the most potent weapon in a democracy's arsenal is not martial force, but rather industrial output, the capacity of a liberated populace to out-construct, out-manufacture, and eventually swamp tyranny through sheer volume. The evolution from losing 4 vessels to fielding 14 Essex-class carriers in active duty remains history's paramount illustration of an industrial answer to a military emergency. While most of those laborers have since passed on, their accomplishments stand firm. During humanity's bleakest period, when fascism sought to snuff out liberty, the American workforce answered with the most massive wave of manufacturing energy ever seen. The 4 vessels destroyed in 1942, the Lexington, Yorktown, Wasp, and Hornet, were not merely substituted, but were reproduced in multiples. Every fresh carrier was technologically superior to the one it replaced, serving as a monument to democracy's ability to turn catastrophe into victory. Ultimately, Japan was not defeated by American strategic planning or tactical maneuvers. They were vanquished by individuals like Margaret Thompson and her welding torch, alongside millions of Americans who confirmed that the supreme power of democracy resides in the boundless industrial potential of a free people bound by a common goal. The statistics, showing a shift from 4 lost vessels to 14 combat-ready Essex-class carriers, narrate a saga of metamorphosis that stands as the ultimate historical evidence of what free citizens can attain when their liberty is at risk. These individuals constructed far more than mere hulls. They forged victory, secured liberty, and laid the foundations for the future. Their heritage echoes eternally in the inscription found at the memorial at Newport News Shipbuilding. Here, American workers replied to tyranny with steel, countered fascism with freedom, and reversed defeat through the greatest production miracle in human history.